Good afternoon. I hope everybody had a very delightful lunch and took in those sun rays, bit of spring out there. It's my pleasure to welcome you back. Okay, guys, get your seat here. I'm Jane Milosch. I'm supposed to introduce myself and I'm very happy to do so, as a Grant Wood Art Colony board member. And I was fortunate enough to be one of the people that Jim Hayes invited to 1142 to kick off our grassroots first symposium, but it was so beautifully orchestrated. I mean, it's the kind of grassroots that you want. So it's really an honor to be back participating and hosting and sharing this third session for the symposium entitled Visionaries. And I thought I would begin with a brief introduction about Grant Wood's connection to being a visionary, but more than that, even just a definition of what is a visionary, because I think over the course of the papers we've heard so far, a lot of these people fall into that category as an artist, but I want to get a little more specific about what that word means. And the other word that has come up quite often is Gesamtkunstwerk. And so how does that connect up with what we're going to talk about with the two presenters from two different angles? So I have two definitions on the visionary, or almost three, but what is a visionary? Especially a person, I thought that was funny, thinking about or planning the future with imagination or wisdom, a visionary leader. Relating to or able to see visions in a dream or trance as a supernatural apparition, a quote, a visionary experience. A person with original ideas about what the future will or could be like. In a more religious definition of a visionary, a person who has a religious or spiritual experience in which they see a holy person who is not living, or they see a holy event and they cannot be scientifically explained. And I think that's key, because I think the one sort of thread between is this contemplative and performative aspect of these places and environments, that we're seeing a deeply spiritual connection to the material connection, that these things are not broken up. And the guy that kind of started that idea is not a visual artist, but was a composer, Richard Wagner, also German. And so he came up with the term Kunstwerk to describe a total work of art in which the artwork of the future, he believed, would be only art with a capital A, would just be one thing. It would be so seamlessly connected. All music, theater, light, all these sensorial things would come together with the actual material things. And so that they sort of dissolve. If you know Wagner, you just sort of dissolve into everything. But from that term, a lot of different art movements were launched. Most people are familiar with Art Nouveau. I'm more familiar with Jugendstil, but also the connection to the arts and crafts movement. And so thinking a little bit more about that Gesamtkunstwerk, another definition talks about it being roughly, I'll just say this, Gesamtkunstwerk survives mostly prominently in architecture, where all aspects of design, interior, exterior, and furnishing were connected to complement one another. And this influence can be seen in the artistic practices of movements, like I said, arts and crafts, Art Nouveau, Art Deco, Jugendstil, Vienna Succession, Bauhaus, De Stijl, or my favorite example is actually Sagrada Familia by Gaudi. I mean, I think that one shines bright. And maybe the other thing to connect this to is Gothic architecture in general. So even when the very ultra-modern art school Bauhaus was founded, Gropius used a woodcut by Final Leininger of a cathedral. And when we look at Gaudi, he ended up making a cathedral, but that wasn't necessarily what we would have imagined as a traditional cathedral, breaking all the rules. So how does this connect to Grant Wood, and how does this connect to artist colonies and the talks we're about to have? Well, recently I've had the opportunity to do a little more research on something we heard yesterday called the Iowa idea, that started in the 1920s. And this idea that was President Jessup, and he was the president, and Carl C. Shore was the dean, to bring in practicing professional artists to teach. So not people, somebody recently said something about people who can't make art teach. That's not the case here. It was actually the opposite, in the sense that artists are real professionals. Being an artist is a profession. And so whether you're a writer, a musician, or visual artists, the University of Iowa was the first place in the country, in the US, to allow creative work to be submitted as a master's thesis. And Elizabeth Catlett was the first woman, and a Black woman, to be given the MFA here at the University of Iowa. The first official professor to be hired in the art school, and that was the other thing. Then the main premise of this idea was worked out by combining the School of Art with the School of Art History, with the notion that artists are going to be better artists if they have access to the current research. So while we're studying the past, what's happening now, how do you describe it? And so the art historians would see artists making art now in terms of what they're studying. So there was no division between the past and the present. It was, if you're going to go forward, you have to know what is innovation. And I think that's really key. You can maybe have a one-off innovation, but how do you sustain a vision? And I think all the examples that we're seeing today are people who were very well aware of the past, or what we'll hear from Lisa, I think a bit more, had a certainty of another world, that everything that we see isn't everything that there is, that there's more in the world, the things that we do not see, that we do feel, that are deeply spiritual. So the Iowa ID connected with that. And so I kind of wrote sort of 5 characteristics that I think line up in relation to Grant Wood that they'll talk about in terms of their artists, the speakers and their topics I'll introduce in a minute. The first one is that a lot of visionaries are often autodidacts. They're self-taught. Now, they may have learned in one area, but they tend to keep creating and keep inventing and teaching themselves various things. In Grant Wood's case, that is very much the case. He did have some formal training, but really he was most inspired and taught himself through the Craftsman magazine by Stickley, initially metalworking, and then taught, illustration and so forth. And the second thing is dreamers. When Grant Wood became a middle school teacher, one of his famous projects is called Imagination Isle. And he wanted the students to come along and dream with him of a place far, far away. I wanted to read the script, but I can't find it right now. But in the sense, he was creating a creative project with his class. They designed a frieze that went around their classroom, which they painted in conjunction with music and a poem that was read. I mean, Wanda, they can correct me later because I can't remember exactly, but it was this powerful thing of that, it's that performative aspect, but you have to dream it into reality and then make it into reality. So he was very much a dreamer. The third one we've heard a lot about in relation to 5 Turner Alley. The one thing that maybe hasn't come up yet that I think is very important is the fact that he designed it to be a stage set. So it was the theater Cedar Rapids company. So his living space was a performative space. It was a backdrop. He was a character who was stepping onto the stage. So, and not only that, he didn't want to be there by himself. He envisioned 5 Turner Alley as part of a larger art colony that was going to, so 5 Turner Alley was because there were going to be more artist studios, people joining him. So he always had this idea for a colony or vision of, a way of bringing artists together, but also connecting with the community. So there's that performative aspect, that staging aspect, and the environment that he built at 5 Turner Alley, just like we were seeing with Maxwell Parrish, is just filled with objects he collected that you find in his paintings, but more than that, vistas and doors and metalwork, all these things that we've heard. And finally, the entire environment. So I think this is what's interesting about our 2 presentations we're about to hear, the difference between the urban invention and the rural, this agricultural urban. And so when Grant Wood moved from Cedar Rapids, where he's in a carriage house, downtown Cedar Rapids, to this historic mansion in Iowa City, he also had grounds. He finally had gardens. So he was able to completely craft and even expand his environment, a way to relax from what was sometimes not the most exciting, not always supported by the first director of School of Art and Art History, Lester Longman, and Joni Kinsey wrote a beautiful, fascinating essay about Iowa being the battleground for avant-garde and American regionalism. So I highly recommend that to people. But what we're going to hear from today, just wanted to connect that with Grant Wood. Our first speaker is Lisa Stone, who I've had the pleasure of knowing since about the first time we discovered the Grant Wood Studio still existed, when I went to Cedar Rapids to be a curator, and the director said, "Hey, do you know the studio is still standing?" And I'd worked on a Grantwood show with a colleague 10 years before, maybe not quite 10 years before, but we didn't know it was so intact. And Lisa was the first person we talked to, and she invited us to see the Roger Brown studio. We got to go to the Chicago one, but he has another one. So Lisa is an independent curator and preservation consultant. She was a senior lecturer in the Department of Art History, Theory and Criticism, and curator of the Roger Brown Study Collection, both of these based at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. And she retired in 2020. She earned an MS in Historic Preservation at Scholl at the Art Institute of Chicago. She works with Don Howlett on the preservation and planning and implementation through Preservation Services Incorporated. She presented on RBSCS for the Historic Artist Home Studios from 2000 to 2020 and currently serves on the HAHS Advisory Committee. She's also co-author with Jim Zanni of Sacred Spaces and Other Places, a guide to the grottos and sculptured environments in the upper Midwest, and a study exploring the impact of the Grotto of the Redemption in West Bend, Iowa, on the builders of the region. Her title is called Home-Based and Life-Specific Art Environments. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our second speaker so that they can seamlessly transition. Our next speaker is Zach Bleicher. Zach is the founding executive director of the Edgar Miller Legacy nonprofit, whose mission is to preserve the work of the late 20th century artist designer Edgar Miller. By advancing research of Miller's accomplishments and providing opportunities to learn from the artist's bold sense of creativity, work ethic, and artistic philosophy, Bleicher oversees the organization's growing physical archive of Miller's work and is directly engaged with art preservation communities in Chicago to raise awareness and ensure the proper care of Miller's unique architectural project on the city's north side, known as Edgar Miller's Handmade Homes, which is what he's going to talk about today. I think that's the other thing, all the fundraising that goes beyond that. So I hope we can talk about that in our exchange. So at this time, I'd really like to invite Lisa up to make the first presentation.
This up. Is that about the right level? So good afternoon, and thank you, Jane. I'll just say about her introduction what she said, and we didn't talk about this in advance. I'm honored to participate in this conference, which brings together things I'm interested in, including Grantwood, the genres of historic artist homes and studios, and artist-built environments. I want to thank Maura Pilcher, Wanda Korn, and Valerie Ballant, and everybody else behind the scenes for crafting this conference, and the Grantwood Art Colony and the University of Iowa for hosting it. I'm going to briefly introduce the genre of artist-built environments, a current term for artists whose homes, studios, and in many cases gardens or surrounding landscapes are the works of art, not just where they were made, such as Malda Rita and Walter Larson's architecturally modified home in Kewanee, Illinois, enlivened with their singular compositions and arresting color combination. And in some cases, such as the Larsons, the artists become intimately enmeshed in their visual and architectural programs, indistinguishable from them. When I was a kid visiting grandparents in Iowa, I was taken to the Grotto of the Redemption in West Bend. I could say that this is my family, as it shows a mom, a dad, and 2 girls and a boy, but it's actually a stock souvenir color slide. But given how important Midwestern devotional grotto research eventually became for me, it's ironic that I was told that I slept through the entire experience. I eventually woke up. Years later, my colleague Jim Zanzi and I began doing serious research into the grotto phenomenon that eventually became a kind of a area of study, and we wrote a guidebook, which was really just the beginning of ongoing studies that Jane mentioned. And it's really poorly produced on a busted shoestring, but it works as a guidebook. So this is the builder, Father Paul Doberstein of the Grotto of the Redemption, who used the church rectory as his studio. Here he is making some of the many thousands of massive rosettes for his grotto in his living room, an early example of home, or in this case, rectory, as studio. We continue to discover other artists who were inspired by the grand Catholic devotional grottos in Iowa and Wisconsin, and this is just a smattering of several throughout Iowa, including William Leitner's Mother of Sorrows grotto structures in Cedar Rapids, which I mentioned to you because you may want to visit the campus of Mount Mercy University on Sunday when we'll be there. So here are some teaser views. Artist Jane Gilmore, who chaired the art department at Mount Mercy University for many years and is here in the audience. Wave, Jane, somewhere, there you are. Worked tirelessly planning and implementing major restoration projects, literally saving the structures. Thank you, Jane. I had the great fortune to work as curator of the Roger Brown Study Collection, an artist's home museum, special collection, and archive of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And the Roger Brown Study Collection became a member of HAHS in 2000, right at the get-go. So I have been honored to represent the site, or I was honored to represent the site for and with HAHS for over 20 years. And I was supposed to talk about the study collection. Sorry, Wanda, I'm going to wander away. So I don't have time to give you a tour of the collection, but you can take a virtual tour on the collection website or visit in person if you're in Chicago. While at the RBSC in 2002, I worked with Jane Milosch and Cedar Rapids Museum of Art staff on their acquisition of the Roger Brown painting, Great American Farmer, from the school's Roger Brown Estate Collection. And there's no need to state how Grant Wood inspired Roger Brown's composition is to this audience, but I'll do it anyway. Some of the pleasures the HAHS network kindles constantly are the many connecting threads between and among artists separated by significant temporal and cultural distances. Discovering the parallels, associations, and echoes is endlessly interesting for me. So to present a quick overview of the range of artists' homes in the genre of artist-built environments, I'll begin with the Palais Ideal of the facteur or postman Ferdinand Cheval, who built an astonishingly complex and original sculptural architectural complex between 1879 and 1924, adjacent to the home he also built in Eaux-Rives, France, a few hours south of Lyon. And that's the facteur in the center. The edifice presents a curious physical paradox, seemingly monumental and humanly scaled simultaneously. One can experience the entire structure intimately, walking around the exterior, through the interior, and up sinuous staircases to terraces. Cheval wanted to be buried on his home property at the Palais Ideal, but it was not allowed in Eaux-Rives. So he spent the last 8 years of his life from 1916 to 1924 building his final home or final resting place, his tomb of eternal silence and rest in the local cemetery. Artist and architect Carl Juncker studied and then returned from a grand tour through Italy to his home city of Lemgo, Germany. And in 1889 made a formal application to build a house. And he's shown here many years later with the model. Unlike many builders who work extemporaneously, Juncker meticulously planned his home down to the finest details. The house combines Palladian massing, Italianate features, and windows that feel kind of Venetian. The exterior is exquisitely detailed and polychromed with hand-carved bony shapes. And entering the house, you become encompassed within an overwhelmingly carved space. It's almost like being in a Grimm's fairy tale where the house feels like it's growing around you. Juncker filled the home with a fantastic amount of handmade furniture, and the caretakers, the custodians can't fit it all in the house. including a child's room, all for a family he never had and didn't plan on having. So it's a home that's symbolically, emblematically, and maybe psychically about the layered ideas of home, and is one of the most intensively handmade places that has echoes with Edgar Miller's work that we'll hear about next. The site is expertly preserved and interpreted. Visitors move from a contemporary orientation space and museum through a breezy bridge on the left to the back door over expanded metal that takes the dirt off your shoes. And instead of velvet ropes, they have platforms so people can be in rooms without impacting them. Back in the US, the complex built by Italian immigrant Sabato or Sam Rodia, known as the Watts Towers, is as improbable as it is stunningly beautiful. Rodia was born in 1879, and very, very, very long story short, he began building his opus in 1921 and continued for 34 years when he deeded the property to a neighbor and walked away. I'm going to show a clip from the film The Towers from 1958, and this was a graduate school project. And you can find the full 12-minute video on the LACMA website. And apologies for the pixelated quality. It's the best I could get.
Sam Rodia, tile setter by trade, Italian born,
Can you put the volume up a little?
builder of the fine towers.
It's not responding to my finger.
I've been at the tower myself, and I've got it back in my mind. I know I want to do some things. I said, I'm going to do something. I'm going to do something. I'm going to do something.
For 30 years, a man lives alone in a house with a bed, a chair, a table, with the music and the faded symbols of the time when he was young.
So I'll mention here that at some point, someone showed Sam Rodia a postcard of Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, and Sam looked at it and said, one man built that? So at any rate, the clip ended with this image of Rodia's embellished fireplace and framed photos. And here you see the image on the lower left is a postcard of the Dickeyville Grotto in southwestern Wisconsin, which is closely related to the Grotto of the Redemption. Rodia claimed to have worked on the Dickeyville Grotto, which is hard to substantiate and roundly debated, but I'm going to take his word for it. And that's Father Wernerus, the builder of the Dickeyville Grotto. And it's just another one of the tantalizing threads between and among artists separated by great temporal and cultural distances. Years later, vandals burned down his house and only the fireplace remains. And here's a restored view. The towers were listed in the National Register of Historic Places in April 1977 and became a National Historic Landmark in 1990. Before showing a few more elaborate sites, I'm going to show a few more modest but no less marvelous home projects. Isaiah Henry Robertson was born in 1947 and grew up in St. Thomas, Jamaica. When he was 8, he asked his mother what Jesus did, and she told him he was a carpenter. So he decided that's what he would be. Known as Prophet Isaiah Robertson, he began ornamenting his Second Coming house in Niagara Falls, New York in 2005. He worked on it and animated it with commanding oratory performances until his death in 2020. And here you can see that it's in an ordinary single-story front gabled vernacular house in an ordinary neighborhood that's compositionally sophisticated and flat out original while retaining its basic houseness, reflecting Robert Venturi's concept of both/and, who wrote, quote, "I am for richness of meaning rather than clarity of meaning. I prefer the both and to either or." And that was just a partial quote of his much debated conviction. I like to let the artists have a little bit of their own voice included. So I'm going to show a clip from this video by Fred Scruton to give you a sense for how the house isn't merely decorated, but each element is symbolic, and it's a stage for the prophet's rich and heartfelt exhortations.
Now you see all these stars here, praise the Lord. God take Abraham out of the tent, and he says to him, look in the sky. Abraham looked in the sky. He said, you see those stars? Abraham said, yes. He said, can you number them? Abraham says, no. He said, I'm going to multiply your seed as the stars in the heaven. Praise the Lord, oh my soul. So this is what these stars represent. Praise the Lord. And all of us is a star. Praise God. You see these candle lights here? Praise God. Jesus said you cannot light a candle and put it under the bush. Praise God. So here is a reminder with symbols. Just before the Bible time, God used symbols.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you, Prophet Isaiah Robertson. This is a little bit of a rough cut here. No one expressed their love for beer more ardently or recycled their empties more artistically than John Milkovich. Beginning in 1968, the retired upholsterer began altering his home and garden at 222 Malone Street in Houston, one beer can at a time. After 18 years of work and God knows how many beer cans, he transformed a typical bungalow into an elegant and original showplace that can still be clearly read as a typical bungalow in beer can clothing, both and. The beer can house, which looks much different today than when I took the previous slides in 1982, is preserved and open to the public by the Orange Show Foundation for Visionary Art in Houston. And you can visit that today or tomorrow. I'm always excited and humbled to try to introduce any of these artists in fewer than 3 hours, especially Mary Knoll, who created work in many mediums, including sculpture, painting, printmaking, jewelry, ceramics, drawing, illustration, writing, journaling, and exceptional placemaking. Born in 1914, Knoll was raised in Milwaukee. She went to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago from 1933 to 1937, which jump-started her lifelong creative practice. She returned to her family cottage on the shore of Lake Michigan, and when she finally had the house to herself, rather than engaging in the professional mainstream art world, Knoll poured her creative energy into a private home-directed life, shaping and animating her home inside and out. She enlivened the surfaces of the house with a technique of sponge painting using pieces of pile carpet to achieve her patterns. And her work was integral to and incorporated within her home environment. Apparently, there are only 5 objects in the entire house that weren't made or altered by Mary. In terms of the life-specific home-based aspect of Knoll's artistic path, it's worth mentioning that choosing not just to work at home, but to have home be the entire context of one's work is the single thing that makes most artist-built environments seem so remote from the mainframe art world. But actually, this mode of working is in cadence with, and in many ways anticipated or anticipates contemporary mainframe concerns. Home studio environments like Mary Knoll's challenge notions of where art was or is supposed to take place, where it should be experienced after it was or is made, not even mentioning the idea held by some that art gains its true value only when it's a commodity. Quite surprising to some, Knoll's participation in the artistic community came after her death, with her bequest of over $11 million to the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, establishing the Mary L. Knoll Fund for Individual Artists. The site is preserved by the John Michael Kohler Art Center in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, notably by artist Alex Gartelman, who has spent 4 years living there, and he still lives there, working on every square inch inside and out. And the site was listed in the National Register in 2005. S.P. Dinsmore was born in Ohio in 1843. I don't have time to outline his biography, but after a number of occupations in the Midwest, he moved his family to Lucas, Kansas, where he built his cabin home out of post-rock limestone and concrete. And this house is really amazing. He built it as a showplace, and the family lived in the garden basement. People could tour the interior and see doors, windows, and trim made of California redwood. And for some reason, a display of virtuosity, I guess, no two doors or windows are the same dimension. Then at age 64, he spontaneously combusted into a placemaker extraordinaire, creating an expanded spatial narrative expressing his social, political, spiritual, and deeply personal beliefs around the cabin home. Moving through his sculptural spectacle, one enters through an Adam and Eve concrete arbor, and then arriving at his final tableau, The Crucifixion of Labor, which was a kind of late 1920s Occupy Lucas social political statement, which is considered to be unfinished. Would love to see where he would have gone with this. And many scenes in between. Dinsmore's Garden of Eden is an immersive open work panorama surrounding his remarkable home in the post-rock limestone region of the dusty Great Plains. Like Ferdinand Cheval, Dinsmore wanted to rest eternally at his home in the Garden of Eden. He built his own stepped pyramidal mausoleum and took this double exposure, gazing at himself in his homemade coffin, where you can still see him today. The site has a long, rich preservation history, and it was listed in the National Register in 1977, 15 after after the Watts Towers. The Garden of Eden, Inc. are the devoted site stewards. Eddie Owens Martin was born on July 4th, 1908 in Glen Alta, Georgia, near Buena Vista, and that's the way they pronounce it, where he eventually built his colorful kingdom. At age 14, he ran away, eventually landing in New York City, where he led a spectacularly wild and colorful life. 35 years later, he tired of New York and the various hustling scenes he engaged in and returned to Buena Vista, having inherited his mother's farmhouse. He set up shop as a fortune teller. He was very successful at that, and began transforming his mother's 1895 vernacular Georgia farmhouse into a rambling compound that retains its identity as a vernacular house while becoming something else entirely, both and. The site is divided into garden spaces with walls filled with ceremonial bas-relief imagery and other structures such as his elevated pagoda. And I always thought this must have been this, kind of spiritual meditation space, and it was his beadworking studio. Eddie Owens Martin became Saint Ohm, called the site Passaquan, and he became a Passaquoyan. He had an elaborate belief about an invisible network of nodes in the body that give one radiant power called power suits, and the cone atop of his head is upswept hair. And here's a little clip of Eddie speaking.
Hello there, all you people. This is Marion County in Buena Vista, the county seat, and I made it Martin to live here. I created and draw and sculptures and build walls and everything. And within my heart, I always had a hope that my dream would ring, and it's rung so true.
Thank you, Eddie. Sorry to cut you off so soon. Passaquan was listed in the National Register in 2008, and in 2014, the site underwent a 2-year preservation project by Kohler Foundation and Columbus State University. The university is the site custodian, and they use Passaquan for all manner of academic programming, and they welcome the public for tours and other experiences. And I won't go into other experiences. I wish I had time to relate the extraordinary life work of Noah Purifoy as a designer, artist, co-founder of the Watts Towers Art Center, responder to the Watts Rebellion, curator and radical arts administrator before his last chapter or encore. In the late 1980s, Purifoy moved from Los Angeles to the Mojave Desert and spent the last 25 years of his life creating 10 acres full of large-scale sculpture around his trailer home in the high desert of Joshua Tree, California. And the red lines are the approximate footprint of the site. Now I'm just going to spool through images of the landscape animated by Purifoy, which is a 10-acre installation of sculptures and structures which grew organically with no particular plan, but have many, many narratives by the artist and placemaker who expressed critical aspects of his lived experiences with the junk and stuff of ordinary life, including an expanded Quonset hut, which is a museum holding many of his earlier works, a representation of the gallows from the film High Noon. And this is the remains of the trailer home where Purifoy lived and died in a fire in 2004. The artist Ed Ruscha bought the adjacent property so Purifoy would have a house with more creature comforts, which he lived in for the last few years of his life. The Noah Purifoy site is owned, preserved, and maintained as a museum by the Noah Purifoy Foundation in Los Angeles. So I'm thrilled to reshare the news, which Valerie shared yesterday, that the Noah Purifoy site and St. Omer's Passaquan both became members of HAHS this year, significantly expanding the diversity of HAHS's representation of the nation's art historical legacies. And I'm going to close by briefly mentioning a kind of flip scene scenario in which 4 visual artists, Rashid Johnson, Adam Pendleton, Julie Mayritu, and Ellen Gallagher, acquired and are preserving renowned musician and civil rights activist Nina Simone's childhood home in Tryon, North Carolina, supported in part by the National Trust's African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund. They have amazing plans for the place and are an example, and I hope not a rare example in the future, of visual artists, not just as placemakers, but as place savers. Thank you. And on to Zach.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Lisa. That was, as always, amazing. Let's see here. And I'm really thrilled to be here. I think this is my first time speaking in front of a live audience in several years. So this is really exciting. Thank you to HAHS and to the Grantwood Art Colony, University of Iowa, and everyone that put this together, and all of you and us for being here. I know it's actually, this is really exciting. And I'm excited to introduce you to the work of an artist that I love, and I hope you'll come to love if you don't know much about him, who was another visionary artist and placemaker. Where do you do the, let's do this. Yeah. So James Edgar Miller was a prolific American artist designer whose work consisted of a wide variety of mediums, including painting, sculpture, stained glass, tile, and other forms of craft work. He is also most well known as a visionary placemaker who was one of the driving forces behind the creation of a handful of artistically rehabbed artist colonies on Chicago's near north side during the city's interwar era. His practice consisted of both fine and commercial art projects, architectural and built environments, and philosophical writing, closely associated with 1920s to 30s interwar era Chicago art and cultural movements. Miller was highly regarded as a leading modernist in many creative fields. He became well known as an architectural art designer and artisan, and was highly influential upon vernacular artistic rehab architecture on the near north side of Chicago throughout the mid-century era and beyond. His artistic built environment projects, the Carl Street Studios and the Cogan Miller Studios, which were primarily constructed from 1927 to 1936, were Victorian homes transformed into studio apartment buildings for artists and other creatives. Miller achieved the completion of these buildings at the peak of his ability in his young adulthood. Not only did they influence Miller's own practice and the trajectory of his professional career, these built environments also influenced the lives of many other artists, creatives, and socially conscious activists for decades to come, and continue to do so to this day. Edgar Miller's work immediately resonates with a wide variety of audiences, but perhaps the most common first impression is, how have I not heard of this artist before? Of course, there are many undiscovered artists who are only now becoming, quote, rediscovered, but perhaps what makes Miller's obscurity so surprising is that Miller was at one time a prominent artist who was widely recognized by his peers and critics. And he worked in Chicago during the early 20th century, by then a city that was not exactly a remote outpost, and that was a place where many artists from before Miller's time and since have risen to much wider acclaim. One of the simplest explanations for Miller's general obscurity has to do with the relatively low accessibility of his work, as most of his work was built into architecture and either remains closed off to the public or has been destroyed in the city's rapacious need to constantly demolish its past in ill-conceived market-driven real estate development decisions. Miller was born and raised in Idaho Falls and came from a pioneer family and community tradition of self-reliance and artistic entrepreneurship, and was encouraged from a very young age to develop his skills as an artist. His parents encouraged all 5 of their children to read and be creative, but Edgar stood out and seemed to have a preternatural ability to learn and excel in any artistic medium with simple practice and with little or no instruction. Miller also was encouraged to visit and learn from an older multidisciplinary artist in the Idaho Falls area named Joe He, who ran his own shop overlooking a bend in the Snake River, and where he made paintings and sold furs, metalwork, embroidered saddles, taxidermy, and many other artistic objects and oddities. This formative experience for Miller, when he was less than 10 years old, would influence him and his approach to self-education and to have a do-it-yourself attitude for the rest of his life. Miller began working in Chicago in his late teens when he came all the way from Idaho Falls to attend the School of the Art Institute in 1917. Already technically masterful of the basic arts of drawing and sculpting, printmaking, and woodcarving, Miller did not find art school to be challenging or intellectually rewarding. Miller left SAIC and pursued his own projects, first at the Hull House Studios, founded by Jane Addams, and then in the employ of artist designers Alfonso and Margaret Iannelli, with whom he worked and apprenticed through the mid-1920s. The Iannellis were also masters of many mediums, with Margaret being an expert in avant-garde modernist graphic design, and Alfonso a multidisciplinary artist who could paint and draw, sculpt, fabricate stained glass, and even forayed into industrial design. Miller's interest in becoming a commercial artist and much of his modernist graphic design art aesthetic can be traced to this time working with the Iannellis. While Miller's time spent at SAIC was not particularly fulfilling, the connections he made there would prove invaluable. Miller met some of his greatest influences, like the muralist John W. Norton and the painter George Bellows, amongst likely dozens of other formative teachers and lecturers who graced the halls of what was perhaps the most prominent center of official American art education at that time. Miller would speak often throughout his life about a chance encounter with Bellows, a conversation that likely involved a precocious teenage Miller pushing his way in front of the esteemed artist, and that this single encounter taught him a fundamental lesson and was a turning point for him conceptually about what it means not just to create art, but to form it by using the unseen perspectives and lines emanating from a canvas's edges. Miller also took this learning with him as he expanded into three-dimensional sculptural art, transparent art like stained glass and metalwork, as well as into the artistry of architectural design, which he began to dabble in beginning in the early 1920s. It was also at SAIC where Edgar Miller met Saul Kogan, who would end up being his creative partner several years later in the Near North Side Art Colonies project. Around the time of arriving to Chicago, Miller also almost immediately became involved in the bohemian artistic community known as Tower Town, which was then the epicenter of all kinds of radical thought and expression on Chicago's Near North Side by the Chicago Water Tower. Quickly after the Great Chicago Fire in 1871, this area had been rebuilt as a wealthy enclave north of the Central Business District. But by 1900, the area was already evolving into a lower rent district as the wealthy elite moved further outward, allowing landlords to buy up their mansions and townhomes and divide them into cheap boarding houses and apartments. By the early 1900s, the neighborhood had already become an epicenter of a diverse group of writers, artists, and radical activists. Washington Square Park, directly in front of the Newberry Library, became known as Bughouse Square, so called because of the dozens of soapbox orators and their audiences who populated its grasses on any given day for decades. At one point, thousands of people would flow through this park per week to hear from all manner of radical activists and organizers preaching different varieties of isms that they believed would advance society away from the societal horrors of the Industrial Revolution. By the time Edgar Miller arrived, much was already underway, and the social movements he got caught up in, political and artistic, had been brewing worldwide for some time. Miller's main focus was artistic expression, but he found kindred spirits in many other types of artists and activists in Tower Town, likely because of the anarchistic and self-determining ethos celebrated by the community. Not everyone agreed on which way the world should be going, but they all agreed that the past had its major flaws, and to get the best out of the future, a free flow of ideas and creativity for creativity's sake was paramount. Miller was highly involved in the area's art centers, such as the Dill Pickle Club, where rousing programs were put on, experimental plays were performed, and avant-garde art was displayed. The Pickle was also welcoming to people of all racial backgrounds and sexualities, and from about 1917 to 1927, it was perhaps the most avant-garde venue in the United States at the time, certainly for a large and vibrant consortium of working-class artists and thinkers. After briefly opening and managing the Dill Pickles gallery and print shop around 1925, Miller founded his own studio and gallery in 1926, just around the corner, and called it appropriately the house at the end of the street. There he fabricated and showed his own work, as well as work by contemporary modernists such as Albert Bloch, Blanche Lazelle, Lionel Feininger, and Eric Mendelsohn. While Miller was a polymath artist who worked in a variety of mediums by this time and was philosophically and practically rooted in arts and crafts traditions worldwide, he was also influenced by the great European and Mexican modernists, who were still considered avant-garde by many of the more conservative Midwestern audiences at that time. He also kept himself employed by taking contracting jobs like plastering, painting, and tile laying, experience that would come in handy only a few years later once the Artist Colony project started in full. As noted previously, revolutionary ideas were all about, and in the art, social, and cultural spheres that Miller was working, there was continuous calls and strivings to push away from the previous worldview as it related to creativity and social organization. One of Miller's mentors, Jane Addams, had founded the Hull House in the late 19th century, not only to provide social and educational services to immigrants from all over the country and the world, but she also brought to Chicago a new approach of the arts and crafts movement, where in everyday, quote unquote, low arts were intentionally cultivated and taught in order to allow artistic expression to become a less elitist function of society. And these philosophies aligned with Miller's views. Miller was concerned with moving art forward into the modern future, but he also felt strongly about the deconstruction of the idea that art could only have true meaning if it were considered refined, academic, or intellectual. For Miller was in search of a national American art which would blend all the world's cultures into a unified and distinctly modern expression, and he strongly believed that to instill a national art, the quote, high and low arts, both needed to be practiced by its national artists. In 1927, Miller teamed up with his art school colleague, Saul Kogan, to create an art colony at 155 West Carl Street, now Burton Place, called the Carl Street Studios, endeavoring on what would become a lifelong project for Miller. Later in his life, Edgar wrote in his memoirs, in 1927, an opportunity presented itself, the opportunity to create an environment that could include all the lesser arts. Through enjoyment and curiosity, I had gathered most of the ingredients of my idea of an environment. I had done work at the terracotta factory, overglaze I had done in the school years, stained glass and textiles I had investigated. I had a Logan Medal for both stained glass and batik by 1923. A long apprenticeship had given me experience in sculpture, casting, stone cutting, and wood carving, as well as mural painting. All I needed was a project. Kogan had just returned from an extended trip to Paris, where he had visited similar artist enclaves and became inspired enough to try out a similar mode of real estate rehab at home. With Miller's craftsmanship and building expertise, they transformed aging, dilapidated Victorian homes into live-work studios for artists, other types of creatives, and their supporters and admirers. Built to provide artists with a more affordable, welcoming, and secluded community than the rapidly commercializing Tower Town just to the southeast, the Carl Street Studios blossomed nearly overnight. And within a year, Kogan and Miller began building another art colony at 1734 North Wells Street, now known as the Kogan Miller Studios. Miller took on the role of art director and chief artist craftsman on the project, while Kogan established himself as the financier and general contractor. Within the walls of each unit and the courtyards, Miller installed hundreds of unique and complementary art pieces using materials as varied as paint, stone, wood, metal, tile, glass, and terracotta. Miller is also credited with being the architectural designer for many of the interior and exterior spaces, though he did not possess any official credentials. Another prominent modernist architect named Andrew Rabori signed his name to the paperwork as the consulting architect, though he claimed later in life that he was rarely consulted. However, Rabori must have had an influence on Miller because they became lifelong friends afterwards and worked on several projects together into the 1930s and 40s. Miller was very much in his prime and had been doing interior remodeling, murals, stained glass, and woodworking for many years. He had already worked with prominent architects and designers like Howard Van Doren Shaw, who was also the father of artist Sylvia Shaw, as well as the Iannellis and Barry Byrne, both one-time associates of Frank Lloyd Wright, to name a few, to install major artwork into public buildings, churches, and homes. However, all those projects had been very specific installations, like a sculpture here, a bas-relief there, or a set of stained glass windows. Here, Miller was given the opportunity to have free reign over all creative decisions and to have abundant materials and an entire structure to work with, dismantle, and recreate out of his own imagination. Miller could not have been more excited to get to work right away. Though Miller did have the impression that he was also going to receive some of the income from the buildings too, once they were ready to be rented out. He also seems to have lived rent-free in many of the empty units before they were finished. Miller's main mailing address for many years was 155 West Carl Street. At some point, possibly in the late 1920s, Miller moved into a room at 1728 North Wells Street, just a couple doors down from 1734 North Wells, the address of the Cogan Miller Studios. But to be clear, Miller often worked for no pay on these projects, and in his spare time, while taking paying jobs like designing covers and gift packaging for major department stores like Marshall Field's, or painting portraits of prominent Chicagoans. Eventually, Cogan reneged on whatever deal he had made with Miller, which soured Miller on their friendship and partnership for the rest of his life. Though later in life, long after Cogan passed away, Miller admitted the whole enterprise would not have occurred were it not for Saul. Nonetheless, for many years, a magical creative environment existed for Edgar Miller, and the imprint left on him and so many other artists cannot be understated. Though Miller's practice during these important years, designing and executing the handmade homes, the artist honed many of the artistic skills he would later employ in his future career, while fleshing out large-scale ideas in various materials that he had only dabbled in before. The studios were Miller's raw expression of the ideal home for an artistic community, and as artists flocked to these buildings, over the decades, the neighborhood around them transformed into one of the most artistic neighborhoods in Chicago by mid-century. Miller's ethos was one of fearless creativity, and he used materials in such resourceful and interesting ways that merely passing by them, going to a gathering at one of them, or living in one of them strongly influenced other local artists and architectural rehabbers. After Edgar Miller had essentially moved on by the 1950s and was living on the far north side in a neighborhood called Edgewater, newer residents and visitors to the studios had no knowledge of Miller's contribution to the endeavor, and yet the work spoke for itself and still inspired imitators. Certainly, during the period in which he was working on these projects, Miller's identity was tied intrinsically to the studio spaces. He also lived in and around the project during that time and used the properties as workspaces for himself and his collaborators. For Miller, the Artist Colony project was both a work of art and a place to exhibit art, and to be surrounded by art, incorporating it into one's daily life. Writing in 1936 for Architectural Record on the subject of his last handmade home building, the Fisher Studio Apartments with Andrew Rabori, Miller made his philosophy all too clear. Quote, "Home life, whether in an apartment house or residence, is not a mass production process, but a social adventure which demands the leavening influence of grace and beauty." In spite of his relative obscurity, there in fact were always Edgar Miller supporters carrying the flame with and for the artist. In the 1930s, Miller was asked to help with several WPA-related projects in Chicago and the Midwest, both as an artist himself and also as a teacher, manager, and jurist. Often, selection of artists involved working with other jurists. It's unclear from spotty records of Miller's when he met Grant Wood, but given the context of this talk, it's important to note that they were acquainted. Miller encountered a great number of professional artists throughout his life, and especially those who at any time studied, exhibited, lectured, or lived and worked in Chicago. Miller was always at some kind of epicenter of art culture in Chicago, whether it was at SAIC in the late teens, Towertown and Carl Street Studios in the 20s, or the WPA projects of the 30s. It's most likely Wood's and Miller's paths crossed during the 30s, and hopefully new research in the coming years may reveal more of a connection. By the late 1930s, Edgar Miller had more or less moved on from the artist colonies he founded with Saul Kogan a decade before, but he wasn't really that far away from it, either geographically or in terms of his art design practice. For the next 15 years, Miller set up a live-work studio and salon atop a restaurant known as the Normandy House at 800 Tower Court, directly across from the historic Water Tower, so essentially back to the neighborhood where he used to live in the 1920s. At the Normandy House, Miller continued his personal mission of creating dazzling artistic environments. Miller painted murals, installed sculptural reliefs, carved wooden awnings and furniture, fabricated stained glass windows, and created a high-relief sculptural fireplace. He also designed their menus, postcards, placemats, matchbooks, and even the servers' clothing. The owners of the Normandy House were also artists who Edgar Miller had met in the early 1930s, perhaps even at the artist colonies he created. And this restaurant and Miller's home-based salon were in many ways extensions of the artistic social scenes which were cultivating a Chicago artistic renaissance in the interwar context of Chicago's near North Side. Over the years at the Normandy House, Miller mentored many younger artists, and entertained and had philosophical conversations about art and life with hundreds of other exceptional creators working then in and around the Midwest. Later in Miller's life, when he and his second wife, Dale Holcomb Miller, moved to Clearwater, Florida, they tried to establish another artist colony there out of a motel. Unfortunately, health problems dodged Dale, and she passed away in 1977, only several years after they arrived. Even though this later artist colony experiment ended in failure, it still showed Miller was constantly thinking about how to create places for artists to congregate and to feed his interest in all things new and stimulating. Remarkably, Miller came back to Chicago again and the Artist Colony Project in the 1970s and 80s and executed many more art pieces during an extensive and intensive rehabilitation and preservation period. In 1969, an important behind-the-scenes civil rights activist and philanthropist named Lucy Montgomery bought the Kogan Miller Studios and began to rehabilitate the property. She eventually met Miller in the late 1970s after his return to Chicago, and Montgomery commissioned new stained glass windows by Miller. In the 1980s, a young entrepreneur and businessman, Mark Mamelin, who, full disclosure, was also my late uncle, purchased the Carl Street Studios at 155 West Burton Place and worked with Miller to incorporate new stained glass windows, carved doors, and other artistic rehab work. It is no understatement that to say if Miller had not reconnected with Montgomery and then Mamelin and spent years more in and around the Chicago artist colonies, that it's not likely we would even be talking about Edgar Miller today. That connection enabled the younger generation, led by Mamelin's efforts, to spearhead preservation efforts after Miller's death in 1993. Mamelin would go on to rehabilitate Miller's masterwork, the Glasner Studio, at the back of the Kogan Miller Studios, and underwrote the publication of the seminal book, Edgar Miller and the Handmade Home, Chicago's Forgotten Renaissance Man, by Richard Cahan and Michael Williams, which was published in 2009. Mamelin, who died suddenly in 2013 at age 67, also was instrumental in the founding of the nonprofit Edgar Miller Legacy, which was formally incorporated in 2014, several months after his death. Edgar Miller's prolific career spanned almost the entire 20th century and consisted of thousands of individual art projects, big and small. Yet it's these handmade homes he created in the interwar era that have come to define his career more than any other project. These artist colonies were the apotheosis of so much of Miller's creative capacities and artistic philosophy, such that he was delighted to see later generations venerating his work there, perhaps at the expense of many other projects he completed in the years before then and afterwards. Miller understood that the Artist Colony Project had affected him tremendously, and that it had inspired so many others and would likely continue in that vein for many years to come. His approach to art and life, and through his work, Miller Edgar Miller continues to dare artists to throw themselves into a project out of the enjoyment of it, rather than as a purely intellectual pursuit. Many artists continue to this day to find themselves visiting the artist studios and becoming reinvigorated by Miller's radical vision for a way of incorporating art into one's life. But going back again to the 1930s, Alice McKinstry, writing in the August 1930 issue of The Woman Athletic, commented, "A place to live is a place to live. Walls, ceiling, stairway, kitchen, porch. Mankind has to have them if he is to continue his ordered habits. Sometimes it makes no difference whether they are beautiful or not. There is a kind of decent comeliness that suffices very well for many homes. The clean, cheap rug, the comfortable chairs, the uninspired covering of a wall with loopings or bedraggled flowers. If you feel that a home should only be this, and a springboard to leap lightly toward movie or baseball game, stay away from the Edgar Miller Studios on Carl Street and Wells Street, for they will fill you with the haunting surety that you are missing something remarkable and lovely in this world." Thank you.
So we're running a little bit behind time, not because of our speakers, but because we got started a little late and I went on a little too long, but I want to make sure we still have time for questions. Maura, can we extend, start our break a little later?
Yes, if people are okay with that, 'cause we will end the day a little earlier. We had a last minute cancellation. Julie McGee, and we should be talking to the online people. Julie McGee canceled at the last minute, so we will be ending on time, if not early. So I think it is okay if we extend the Q&A a little bit. We will still have time for a break, and then we'll have the last two speakers. Okay.
Thank you. So I just want to kick it off then with one question, sort of the one common theme is this notion of rehab, because it's another one that Grant would love, but it manifests itself in so many ways. So I don't know who wants to start off with that, because you've both told, I mean, it's obvious from these things that what appears to be something suddenly becomes something else in the hands of these artists. And also resources are not always as rich as one would hope. So Lisa, do you want to? Oh, there's supposed to be a mic.
Right.
Well, you're getting that together.
Yeah, go ahead.
Dive in and comment actually not for Zach, but about Edgar Miller's that may not have been as apparent if you don't know how much Edgar Miller and Saul Kogan and others took 19th century buildings and just completely, it wasn't even rehab, it was reinvention, reimagine, and turn them into, kept the bones somewhere, but they're not even hardly visible. And that is really extraordinary to me.
I think it's a really good question, especially you were talking earlier about the difference between an urban artist colony or artistic environment and a rural one. One of the things that we know drives urban environments tremendously are these real estate markets where prices become so inflated that the artists that were, say, living in that Tower Town neighborhood because the rents were very cheap were suddenly getting pushed out of this beautiful community that they had created, and then had to go find other places where they could move that were more affordable. Of course, there were people living there who then end up getting priced out by the influx of sort of the more middle class folks that followed the artists. And so the rehab that was going on in the 1920s and 30s, of course, we're also, not commenting about the big deal that was going on then called the Great Depression, was something that was driving a lot of these, just the materials and things that were being produced for Edgar Miller and his cohort of artists to make these spaces. And so without thinking about that bigger context, you don't really understand maybe why this was all happening or just how it happened, was allowed to happen.
Right. But again, speaks to the artist's resourcefulness in the sense that they're not going to stop creating just because they don't have the perfect materials. They're going to take what's at hand and live with it and use it. So we don't have as much time for questions. So who would like to kick things off out in the audience? John.
I have a question. So what stands out to you about how these artists funded these renovations and creative spaces within their homes? Because if they weren't nationally known and selling art, how do they go about doing that? What stands out to you about how they funded these creative exercises?
I think, well, I showed so many places that it's hard to generalize, but I think in terms of so many of placemakers that were using their home as a starting place, they just worked with what they had and somehow figured it out within the rest of their lives. Many of the artists, maybe half of the artists worked other jobs. A lot of the projects that I showed were done in retirement years and or early retirement years, and we're not, I'm trying to think through everyone I showed, sites that took a huge amount of money. Edgar Miller projects are much different and in urban setting, but with buildings that could be acquired during the Great Depression, as Zach mentioned.
Mhm. Right, and I think that it's also important to mention that through the thread of all these different artists is someone like Edgar Miller or someone like many of these other artists that Lisa shared with us, that they're putting in all this effort for the love of it. And so how do you quantify that financially? You really can't. In the case of Edgar Miller, Saul Kogan was very much the person managing the finances. And in some ways, I didn't go into all the details, but not always properly. But it was the 20s and 30s. And, so he was sort of playing. Miller was so uninvolved with he would make money in order to survive, but he wasn't thinking about himself as a financial engine at all. And so that disconnect from, which is perhaps fantasist, like a lot of artists are, they don't want to live in the real world, or what we call the real world, with money and obligations. So they just keep creating and hope that money eventually comes. And in Miller's case, that happened. But also he never really got compensated for the work either.
I'll just mention one follow-up thing. The facteur cheval, or the postman in Orly, France, worked as a postman for most of the years leading up to building, and many of the years of building. He had a 32-kilometer route that he would go during the day, and then he'd set rocks aside and stone, and actually there's this, he tripped over a stone, and I think that's a French thing, and then had the idea. It's not the only example, but he was working and thinking and thinking and thinking. And then finally, so he was building it in his mind, gathering materials while being employed. And then finally, even though he would dress up in his postal outfit after he, completed the palais, and kind of show himself as a working person.
Trip. Yeah. She's got a mic.
I know, I forgot.
So Lisa, a lot of these creators that you're talking about would have in an earlier generation been referred to as outsider artists. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of that term and why, it's not really, I've noticed that you certainly don't use that term in terms of thinking about these environments. How have we sort of moved away from that term, if we have?
Some of us have, and some of us never will. I really reject the term as being paternalistic, and first of all, the artists in question would not call themselves outsiders, so end of subject. But also, the term serves the market really well. It doesn't serve other situations too well. And certainly, I don't think it serves the artists well. But it seems to be a fallback, and there have been so many generations of people using it that young students today, when I was teaching, I would be really vigorously say, I do not use this term. I'm not talking about outsider artists. I'm talking about artists from all different kinds of of relationships to the so-called mainframe. And I think the major difference, if we could generalize between artists, many of the ones that I was discussing, is that they weren't making work directed at the academic mainframe, whether or not, the larger world discovered their work. I've kind of given up fighting the term, but anyway, that's that.
I think we have time for one more question in the middle here.
Just to follow up, I think I was so interested in the grotto artists because they weren't purely working in isolation, but they were looking at each other. And there was almost like a history of art that could be told, I think, unless I'm misunderstanding your presentation, that sort of has like an alternate model from the sort of the binary of insider and outsider, when in fact there are these whole networks of quote unquote outsider or visionary artists. And I'm wondering if that's something that you've detected in your research, and that I haven't seen your book, so I apologize for that, but I would like to hear more about sort of this alternate history of art of sort of against this idea of isolation.
Thanks. Great question. I can only really go into that in terms of Midwestern grotto builder history, and with the Grotto of the Redemption begun in about 1912, which it shocked me that I never kind of put it together that the use of concrete in the castle. Why am I blanking out on Font Hill Castle and the museum and the Moravian pottery, exact same time. And people are discovering new technology, the very recently availability of concrete to not only builders of grain elevators and so forth, but to homes and grottos and so forth. But in a kind of real quick nutshell, the Grotto of the Redemption presented this, sort of city block, very large presentation of heavily embellished concrete. In the Dickeyville Grotto, a little bit closer to Madison, Milwaukee, Chicago, and other more urban areas, was an example where the builder didn't need to have precious stones and minerals, but he would use broken glass and crockery. So like everyone can go bust up a china cabinet and do that. So, I mean, not everybody, but you don't have to go and get train car loads of geodes and so forth. So that the Dickeyville Grotto had a major impact on a number of builders and a couple of generations of builders in primarily Wisconsin, definitely Iowa, a little bit of Illinois, and it just became a matter of influence. And so it has its own, it really developed into a tradition. And there are lots of other ways to explain things that have happened in that kind of casual way in other areas of the country of seeing things. I always tell students, if you find something really interesting, explore the area, because you're going to find a lot of other things. And then, with a little bit of open mind and discovery, you're going to see how things evolve in an area in a more kind of rhizomatic way. Mm-hmm. So do you have anything to add?
No, I just want to add that I think that was a great way to end on, that art is never created in isolation. Even if the artist is working in isolation, it's because they're attuned to their environment. And so it's always an interaction of the two. I think of that work in prayer, that sacred and vernacular, again, that there's much more of an intersection. So we're going to break for 10 minutes, right, Maura? And so grab them for more questions, because they were packed. And I want to thank our speakers for really, two fascinating but connected presentations. Great.